All right, well, welcome. I'm delighted to be interviewing Claire Williams as part of the Virtual Undergraduate History Showcase in 2021. And so I'm going to ask Claire a few questions about the paper that she developed as part of an exit seminar in the history program. And it'll be a chance for us to to learn a little bit more about undergraduate research here. So thanks for being here, Claire. So I guess one thing that a question that we almost always like to ask is, how did you come to the topic of your paper? And maybe you could just tell the audience a little bit about what your paper is about.
Yeah, so my paper is titled Slavery in the Discipline, the Methodist Episcopal or General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, 1844. It is the year that the Methodist Episcopal Church, the largest at the time Protestant denomination in the US, split in two between the North and the South after a very contentious debate involving the issue of slavery. I sort of landed on this topic because I've been a lifelong Methodist. It's now the United Methodist Church after the church came back together after the split. But recently we've been facing a lot of talk and issues that look like the church might start to split. And amongst the debates and the talks about splitting the church, this General Conference 1844, in which the church had split once before, is often brought up as a sort of, we've done this before, we can do it again. And there's been this popular narrative about the split being something of the Northerners taking a moral stand against the Southerners on the topic of slavery. And I really wanted to piece that out and understand exactly how that went, both because I find the history of institutional religion really interesting, and also to see if there was something that I could apply, some similarities between what had happened then and what's happening now.
Great, thanks so much for that. And I think one thing I really appreciate about that, so you were completing this paper as part of an exit seminar on the Civil War era. And I think one thing that can be good for students who might be watching this to know is that ideally when you do your exit seminar, of course, it's something related to the topic of the seminar, but hopefully you find a way to bring your own interest to bear in this. I think one of the things that made this paper so successful, that was really clear that you had a narrative you were kind of holding up for analysis by using the archival materials to kind of evaluate that. And I think it made it a really engaging and very closely analyzed paper that was really grounded in a close focus reckoning with the sources itself. But that idea that the questions we ask about the past are almost always informed by our interests in the present. And I think your ability to combine those things in this paper is part of what made it such a compelling piece of research. And so, I mean, following on to that question, I think the argument that you end up making in the paper really comes as an answer to that question about, to some degree, it's a story that has been told about the nature of that split. Does it comport with what you found in the evidence? And so maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what your overarching argument was, and maybe at the same time a little bit about the evidence that led you to that conclusion.
Yeah, definitely. So my argument basically ended up being that the story that I knew and had been told was not exactly false, but much more nuanced than I had been led to believe. So initially, the split was over slavery. The Southerners thought that the Northerners had infringed too much upon the Southern right to hold slaves. And so the Southerners left the church and formed their own church. But through the evidence that I used was the reports of the debates of Annual Conference 1844, and it outlined basically verbatim the reports, the debates that were given during this time, the arguments made, who made what arguments, and I really pieced through this really, really long, dense document to understand exactly what decisions were being made about slavery. And I found out that the issue wasn't exactly slavery itself. Slavery was sort of tangential to the decisions being made at the conference. The conference decision was really about adhering to the constitution of the church and the rules of the church really strictly. Because the church was a totally national church that spanned both in slave states and in non-slave states, they had rules that said that those who held slaves were not able to hold office essentially or preside over any areas where there were where slavery was outlawed. And another tenet of Methodism was that of itinerancy, which meant that any ordained preacher or bishop who was the person sort of in charge of all the preachers had to be able to move freely throughout the entirety of what's called the connection of the church. So anywhere there's a church, a bishop or a preacher should be able to be assigned there, no issue, which caused the problem because the issue at hand in this conference was that there was both a reverend, a traveling preacher, and a bishop who had recently come into owning slaves, which meant that they were not able to itinerate freely and could not be assigned to the whole breadth of the Methodist Church in the United States. And so all of the decisions made were based on a strict adherence to this rule of itinerancy. It was never a moral debate over slavery. In fact, when the morality of slavery was questioned and brought to the floor of the conference, it was quickly swept off the floor. Those conversations were stopped very quickly. And so what I learned was that this idea that it was a moral decision on the northern part of the church is not actually true. It was really about being able to follow the laws very strictly, and the Southerners saw that as an overreach and realized that had the morality of slavery really been brought to the table, they would have lost that vote.
Yeah, I thought it was such a compelling analysis of the evidence, because I really appreciated the way that part of what you were willing to do was work with some really dull and dense material to really try to understand the terms of the debate under which this schism actually emerged. And I think it was really, you made a very compelling case that even though this was about a conflict over slavery and the church's moral responsibility in relationship to enslaved people, in reality, that it was not a kind of heroic story of abolitionism. It was a much more attenuated kind of stuttering separation, which then goes on to have really significant consequences. And yet I think you really made that case by way of a careful analysis of primary source evidence. And that's, I think, one of the things we would really love to see in those seminar papers, and why your paper was nominated for a prize, because it really did that work so effectively. So I appreciate your taking time to talk with me today, Claire, and tell me a little about the research project. And I want to congratulate you on the research paper itself, but also on your graduation. And it was a pleasure to work with you in developing it.
Thank you so much. It was nice to talk to you.
Okay, bye.